Hello, my name is Adam Hooks. I'm a professor in the Department of English and the Center for the Book at the University of Iowa, and I'm a specialist in Shakespeare's poems, and I'm here now to introduce A Lover's Complaint and The Passionate Pilgrim. I'm going to start with the latter because The Passionate Pilgrim is by far my most favorite Shakespearean artifact, to the extent that my commitment to The Passionate Pilgrim is such that I actually have the printer's ornaments that frame each of the poems tattooed on my arm. So, with those qualifications out of the way, what is The Passionate Pilgrim? It was printed and published in 1599, right in the middle of Shakespeare's career, by William Jaggard. You might recognize that name because a couple of decades later he was responsible for printing the first folio. Um, it includes 20 love poems, many of them traditional sonnets, um, and many of them are on the theme of Venus and Adonis. So you might want to look back really quickly to the introduction I did for that poem earlier this year. Some of the poems feature explicitly the figures of Venus and Adonis. Others include personifications of love that could be taken as Venus. The point here is that the Passionate Pilgrim cannot be understood properly without its companion, Venus and Adonis, and they were sold from the same bookshop, even, so people could get even more of that sweet love poetry that Shakespeare was so known for. This really helped um, consolidate his reputation for a particular kind of love poetry, which was also evident in plays like the sensationally popular recent hit in 1599, Romeo and Juliet, or as I like to call that play, Juliet and Romeo, or just the tragedy of Juliet. In fact, the name The Passionate Pilgrim is taken from that sonnet that Juliet shares with Romeo when they first meet, in which the language of saints and of pilgrimage and of purging sins leads up to a kiss. Another really important thing, a caveat here, we now think that we know that only 5 of the 20 poems in The Passionate Pilgrim were actually written by Shakespeare. No one knew this for a very long time, but starting in the 18th century, people figured out that some of the poems that Jaggard included in the collection were actually attributed elsewhere in print to other authors. Now, there's still a bunch of poems that we have no idea who wrote. They're all unattributed. The most important thing to my mind is that no one knew that Shakespeare didn't write these poems for a long time. And so this was a quintessentially Shakespearean or Shakespeare-ish work. It was reprinted in 1612. The poems were reprinted in 1640, and it has always held a place in the Shakespeare canon. So, what are those 5 poems that we're reasonably certain Shakespeare wrote? Well, 3 of them are copied from Love's Labour's Lost, another play that is filled with poetry, like Juliet and Romeo, which stages the composition and reading of poems. Um, and 3 of the inset poems appear in slightly different versions in The Passionate Pilgrim. Love's Labour's Lost was printed just the year before in 1598. So maybe Jaggard, as a skillful reader, was able to um, determine that here's another source for Shakespeare's poetry. The first 2 sonnets in The Passionate Pilgrim are alternate versions of what we now call sonnets 138 and 144. I say alternate versions, maybe earlier versions, maybe simply an adaptation of some kind. The versions are quite different, and so I do urge you to compare as you're reading the Passionate Pilgrim poems 1 and 2 with sonnets 138 and 144. Taken together, the Passionate Pilgrim is a coherent collection of love poetry. Um, it's a really enjoyable read, and it really teaches us a lot about what defined Shakespeare during his career in his lifetime. It was also the first chance that readers and customers had to access some of Shakespeare's sonnets. Um, Remember, the sonnets were not published until 1609. Um, so this is a full decade before, and we have references to his sonnets circulating amongst his, quote, private friends. So Jaggard had really come across something, whatever it was that he compiled together, that was of value to readers at the time. So about those 1609 sonnets, that is where we find A Lover's Complaint. It is a brief narrative poem that's appended to the end of the 154 sonnets. Just like the sonnets, just like the Passionate Pilgrim, A Lover's Complaint is attributed right there on the page to William Shakespeare. It was not uncommon for such complaint poems to accompany a sonnet sequence. It may be less familiar to us today, but this was a totally standard thing, so it shouldn't be thought of as out of place at all. Um, in the critical history of Lover's Complaint, especially in the 18th and 19th into the 20th centuries, a lot of scholars have kind of asked questions about, well, what is this poem doing there? But it would not have been an anomaly when it was first printed in 1609. In many ways, as many perceptive readers of the sonnets have pointed out, Lover's Complaint kind of recapitulates and re-examines some of the same themes that we can see throughout the sonnets. Love, loss, mortality, the power of language to move someone, to express desire, to take action. To my mind, though, it can be read quite fruitfully on its own or in conjunction with not only the sonnets, but any of Shakespeare's other poems and plays. It's an astonishing work of verbal art. And the focus, your focus perhaps, something to maybe ask yourself while you're reading it, is what is the function of voice in this poem? There are multiple voices, all layered and sometimes ventriloquized on top of one another. How does that compare to some of the transpositions of voice, say in the sonnets or in Venus and Adonis, or in some of the coy poems in Passionate Pilgrim? The poem features at its center the complaint of a distraught, abandoned lover who has been seduced by a man thanks to the tokens, love tokens that he has given her that she is ripping up and throwing into the river. But above all, because of his words. Uh, Most of the poem is taken up with a recitation by the woman, by the lover, of the stories that were told to her by this man who seduced her, recounting this to a kind of older figure, a kind of stand-in for us as the audience who is overhearing this entire situation. I'm not going to spoil the end for you, but there is quite a twist at the very end of the poem. This lamentation, this complaint from the lover, this accusation of false pretenses that she has been seduced by, kind of flipped on its head at the very end. So that's another thing to keep in mind while you're reading this. So, that said, I really hope you enjoy my favorite Shakespearean work, The Passionate Pilgrim, and A Lover's Complaint, which is not far behind in my estimation. So please do enjoy.